questions and answers. So again, my name is Sorin Thomas. I identify as queer and transgender. I'm a licensed professional counselor and a licensed addictions counselor. And I am the founding and executive director of Queer Asterisk. So Queer Asterisk is a 501c3 nonprofit in Colorado. And something that makes us unique is that we are a team of queer and trans identified counselors and educators and professionals. We offer 3 branches of service. First is counseling services. So individual therapy, family therapy, all the different kinds of therapy you can imagine. We do education and trainings, and that's really my passion, has become teaching at schools and hospitals and mental health centers and public service agencies. And then we also have a branch of our organization that is community events and programming. Things like conversation groups and writing groups, art groups, anything that might bring queer and trans individuals together, building a network of safety and connection. So the presentation that I have for you today is going to start out with an introduction to some of these systems that we've inherited. I'm going to talk about privilege and oppression and just the foundations of what we might need to know when working with queer and trans individuals or relating. Also this is can be relevant personally too. And then we're going to dive into talking about biological sex, gender, and sexuality more specifically, and hopefully give you a glimpse into queer and trans experience. And then finally, we'll talk about best practice guidelines and tools and takeaways, and leave some time for question and answer. So I have included my phone number and my email, and at the end, I'll make sure to put that in the chat. If anybody has follow-up questions, please reach out to me, or if you'd like to make a connection, please reach out to me. Not everything that I would want to address will be able to be delivered in this hour. So I welcome you reaching out to me. And also, please know that I love to do this. And if you have an organization or a church or a school that you know of who would benefit from a training like this, please spread the word. This is a revenue generator for our nonprofit. And with those funds, we provide scholarships to queer and trans folks seeking services. All right, so let's jump in. I think this worked before, so I'm going to try it again. I'm going to start off with a little video.
Dear 29-year-old Morgan.
Dear 28-year-old AJ.
Dear 22-year-old Charlie.
You probably look and sound very different right now.
One thing you always need to remember is to stay positive.
Just do what makes you happy.
Really hope you found a job and a place to stay.
I'm still performing, making art, making work that I'm proud of.
And not be a bum, please.
And not compromising on my values.
I hope you're in a good place, because honestly, I can't wait until I'm 27 and I'm done with all this teenager garbage. And
Dear 29-year-old Quinn.
Dear 29-year-old Catherine. Dear 28-year-old Lucy.
I hope that your father has come around and is very, very supportive of you.
Will you ever get there to the point where you're real and everywhere in the hearts of your parents, in the hearts of yourself?
just be happy, please, because I'm miserable right now.
I just wanted to let you know that you're awesome and I love you.
And I hope that you can look in the mirror and finally be happy with who you are. And have people who are happy with who you are too.
And just believe in yourself and you're gonna do great. And I love you so much. Love, 19-year-old Morgan.
Awesome. All right. Thanks. Good job. Great.
Okay, so I bet some of you are glad you have your video screens off. It's really hard for me to watch this video without getting choked up myself. Just wanted to share that with you.
It's interesting you said that because I got all teary-eyed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I wanted to share that with you all because I wanted to put some faces and voices to the people that we're going to talk about. And specifically for this presentation, I chose to speak about students. That was in the title and the description, just because queer and transgender youth are so at risk right now during this COVID-19 pandemic. If you can imagine, lots of young folks are at home, maybe in supportive or less supportive environments, isolated from their friends, which is already difficult if you're a young person, and maybe not able to go to school programs and after school programs where they do find support. And then the other reason why I just generally show this video is that I feel the underlying message of this presentation, for me anyway, is that we all need to feel seen, understood, loved, and celebrated in order to thrive, especially those of us with marginalized identities. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about marginalized identities. And I just want to say up front that there's probably some of this material that is review for folks. I really have no way of knowing what everybody's level of understanding is. And then maybe for some folks, this is going to be brand new. But I thought we'd just start from the very beginning and develop a common language together. And then I'll try to move quickly into the parts that are new and exciting for most of us. So I just want to start out with this concept that is kind of the bane of queer and trans folks of our existence. That is the binary. And all that means is categorizing things in twos. So computer programming, ones and zeros, brilliant for things like light switches on and off, but as you can imagine, not so brilliant when we're trying to apply binary thinking to human beings, which are so dynamic and complex. And we do this all the time in terms of gender and sexuality. We talk about men and women, gay and straight. In race relations, we have white and not white, the dominant religion and other religions. So we're constantly dividing things into twos. And when we do that, we're also creating a system of what's right and what's wrong, what's more normal, what's less normal, what then has social privilege, and what then is oppressed. And you can see this in every aspect of identity. So I pose the question to myself, if the majority of us, I'm just going to make an assumption here, would rather live in a world where there wasn't oppression and discrimination and yeah, if we could snap our fingers and make that go away and have equality for all immediately, why is it so difficult? There are many answers to that question. The one I'm gonna hone in on just for the purpose of today, and because I was trained as a body-centered psychotherapist, I have interest in the body and the brain. I wanna talk about our brains. So our brains are designed to conserve energy. And particularly our brain stem is a simplistic mechanism of moving towards pleasure and away from pain, a binary, that's it. Now, the trouble here is we also have a limbic system which attaches emotional landscape to that decision to move towards something or move away from something. And we're highly social creatures, so we're learning from the world around us, not just our own experiences, but we're learning from what our guardians and parents have to say about the world, and through media, what's being said about our fellow human beings, who is dangerous, who should be feared, who we should trust. And now we start to create these stereotypes and stigmas about people. And the insidious thing is that they feel like they have an intuitive gut feeling to them. I look at someone and I feel scared because those are all the implicit and explicit messages that I've received. And it gets complicated in our brains. The good news here, though, is that we also have our prefrontal cortex, which is capable of abstraction, abstract thought, and a lot of complexity. And the trick is going to be how to filter implicit bias through our prefrontal cortex so that we can put a gap between our impulses and our responses. So what I believe, and you certainly don't have to believe this, is that there is no escaping. We are all racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic. And I'm even going to level the playing field once more to say that even someone like myself who has several marginalized identities, we can talk about being transgender right now, I still don't have a freebie in terms of transphobia. And the reason why that is because I've received the same implicit and explicit transphobic messages. And for me, because I hold that identity, they get housed in my system as internalized oppression. So that's why I say that none of us, regardless of our identities, can really escape being racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, all of these things. Now, of course, our socialization gives us different experiences. And so living as a trans person in the world, I have done a lot more work around gender equality. I can just, say that from my own experience. And so it does give me a bit of a leg up when relating across genders and within transgender community. I do have more information about how that level of oppression and shows up and can maybe, could maybe be more of a solution to the problem, which I would like to talk about later in a second. So, so that's the good news in my mind. I just want to go back for a second. We were talking about the binary system, and what I didn't mention is that we had just been talking about a dominant narrative of all of these intersecting identities that are either privileged and oppression, or privileged or oppressed, from race, ethnicity, religion, everything. What we're going to talk about for the remainder of this presentation is one section of the dominant narrative, which we're calling heteronormativity. And heteronormativity can be described as a piece of that dominant narrative pie, where we're looking at biological sex, gender, sexuality, and relationship constellations, we could call it. So I want to bring your attention to this roadmap of heteronormativity here. And there's a couple of things I want to say when we're on this slide. And first of all, I want to just point out a couple of false assumptions here. So the first one is that sexuality in this heteronormative model is determined by gender identity, and gender identity is determined by sex assignment at birth. So if a child is assigned male at birth, the doctor declares it's a boy, then we make an assumption that that child will be a man. And if someone is a man, then they are attracted to women. So the false premises here are many. One is that determination, the fact that this progression is linear, just the fact of linear identity development is a false assumption. And then also, of course, you can see binary here, the pink line and the blue line. Now, I'd also like to just share a little bit about language, point out some things for you. The presentation that I have for you today really doesn't go into language or definitions very much. It's more of a broad stroke presentation, but I'm going to give you a couple of helpful hints. So one place where I see people stumble a lot is how to talk about those early moments of how a baby was born. And I've been asked, yes, but I understand your gender queer right now, transgender, non-binary, all of those words. But were you born a real boy, a real girl, trying to get an understanding of what my, maybe my genitalia is like. That's unfortunately quite normal where our brain can go without stimulus is we want to fill in the gaps of the information that we don't have. So anyway, instead of saying any of those things, what you can say is we can talk about gender and sex assigned at birth. So I will say for myself that I was assigned female at birth. And saying that doesn't take away from my gender identity now in my life. It doesn't negate that. It just is a fact. When I was born, a doctor assigned me female at birth. Similarly, we can talk about socialization. And this can be confusing for folks when they're talking about someone in the past and want to talk about their childhood, their upbringing, who they were before their established gender identity as it's been described to them in the present day. And we can talk about that in terms of socialization. So again, to take me for example, I was socialized a girl. And that doesn't mean that I'm a girl now or a woman now. It just means that that was a huge part of my upbringing. I was socialized a girl. And actually contributes to the kind of person that I am. And so for me as a trans person, not for everybody, I feel I don't have any issue talking about who I am because I was socialized as a girl and what I learned about the world and what I experienced and how it informs my life now. But certainly that's how we can talk about someone's earlier years without negating or without, their identity now. I think those are the main things I wanted to talk about here. We're going to dive into gender and sexuality a little bit more later. So we had just been talking about heteronormativity and the roadmap. And you all can imagine that. It's portrayed in media all the time, how a person grows up and then they start dating and they meet someone and they get married and what their life, basically how their life is set before them from the moment they're born. Now, with queer and trans folks, there is no roadmap. There really isn't. We have tried to put transgender identity development on a roadmap by describing some of the milestones of that a transgender person might pass through, coming out socially and changing their name and their marker, gender marker legally, accessing hormone replacement therapy and surgeries. But none of these things are linear or need to be a part of that person's experience. It's much more of a wilderness and a meandering affair. So what I want to point out here is that not having a roadmap can allow for tremendous creativity. So, I can reference myself and my relationship. We both, my partner and I both identify as non-binary. There are no social norms for us in our relationship about, and I'm just going to be a little bit explicit and crude here for a second, that the vagina in the relationship cooks the meals and the penis in the relationship mows the lawn. And that's really what we're talking about in heteronormative relationships. And sometimes I like describing it that way just to point out how silly that is, and how we take that as truth with a capital T, that women are better at, and we've gotten better over the years, but women are better at taking care of a home and raising children, and men are better at manual labor and working. And anyway, I digress. So a lot of creativity. How do we want gender roles, and who does the chores in our relationship? Even things like who initiates sex, that's gendered in our society. So lots and lots of creativity. What do I want to do with my life? What's my purpose? There isn't a roadmap. I get to make it up as a queer and trans person. But then if you can imagine with me, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for those of you who are familiar, creativity is at the peak there, the pinnacle there. And our basic needs are food, shelter, and in fact, belonging is actually one of our most basic needs as well. And this is the crisis facing queer and trans folks, is that we don't always have our basic needs met. Many of us do not. Basic needs, I'm expanding to talk about medical treatment and employment, housing, all of these things are not, we don't have equal rights yet, or there isn't equality. And so then if our basic needs aren't being met and we don't have a roadmap, there's a lot more trepidation. It's hard to reinvent the wheel when you're just focused on surviving. So now the question is, what does a trans person do well in the world? What does a queer person do in the world? How are we going to figure out our relationship, and who, how we interact together, and how are we going to navigate polyamory, and all of these questions that may or may not be a part of a queer and trans person's life become a lot more difficult. So I hope you are seeing that the two sides of the same coin there. And another reason why we need visibility, so in addition to creating role models for folks so that there is some semblance of, oh, I could be a doctor, or Sorin's a therapist and they're non-binary. Maybe a trans person would be a good therapist, and kind of thinking that way. Another reason is that we are at high risks of being killed and killing ourselves, and suffering from mental illness and substance abuse at much higher rates. And with more visibility and more normalization of queer and trans experience, the less harsh this world is for us. So I just pulled one statistic here, but you can look and find many more, that 41% of transgender and gender non-conforming people have attempted suicide, versus only 1.6% of the general population. So that's drastically increased rate, is very scary, and this is again the crisis that we're facing within the queer and trans community, is just survival. Another statistic that I read and is an estimated global average lifespan of a trans person is only 23 years old. Again, this is estimated, it's global, but it does speak volumes. What I'll say here is that there is some good news, and the good news is that there have been studies that have shown when a queer or trans person has one supportive person in their life, their overall life satisfaction goes way up, their attempted suicide rate goes way down, and all of those other statistics follow. So for the purpose of focusing on youth, this was a study done, 433 trans youth And the ones who had supportive parents reported 72% overall life satisfaction and only 4% suicide attempt rate, versus the youth who had unsupportive parents, 33% life satisfaction and 57% suicide rate. So what I take away from this is that as advocates, allies, people who are validating and normalizing queer and trans experience, who are interrupting heteronormativity and discrimination and oppression, and being active, can have a profound effect on this community that is largely at risk. And you know, there's also studies that show, or you know, what we all know is that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to hurt people. And we can talk about microaggressions as those unintentional, maybe ignorant ways in which we harm people. And what I've been told is it's not if, it's when, right? We all do this. But those have been likened to paper cuts. And yes, they do cause harm, but they are pretty minor. And if we can, like I had said before, if we can engage our prefrontal cortex and filter our behavior, our actions, our words through trainings that we've done, through you know, awarenesses that we have around walking in other person's shoes, and do all of that work, then you know, when I weigh these things out, what I imagine is we can really minimize the number of microaggressions. We can maybe even eliminate any macroaggressions, because those take a little bit more intentionality to be malicious and harmful in that way. And we can really maximize the positive impact we have on people. So I know that, you know, when we talk about social justice work in the world right now, sometimes the narrative can get pretty depressing for me. I'll just speak personally. I can feel an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. How could I possibly have any impact on racism, on homophobia? It's been going on for a very long time, and I'm just one person. And this gives me some hope to think about it this way. The other thing I'd just like to say here, this is a bit off from the presentation, but we're doing good on time. I just want to insert this, is that when we look at the waves of feminism, we started out, first wave of feminism was very much about women are the victims and men are the perpetrators, and we need equality, which was right on, of course. That's what was happening, and there was a need for a fight for equality. But what I want to bring your attention to is how the first three waves of feminism were very much focused on identity and who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. So the second wave of feminism, the question became, oh shoot, what do we do about the lesbians? How does their identity fit into victim or perpetrator? And then it became more difficult again, third wave. Now, where do we put trans women? Are they part of, or are trans people in general? Are they victims? Are they perpetrators? It's very unclear because their gender is not binary and cisgender the way that we had imagined it in the beginning. And finally, fourth wave feminism is where we broke through and stopped talking about whether we were part of the problem or the solution based our identity, and more based on our actions, which I find extremely liberating. So the premises here, the idea here is that, the premise here is that we all are making choices constantly on a daily basis. And some of our choices and our behaviors and our actions, unconscious, conscious, perpetuate systems of privilege and oppression. And some of them interrupt. privilege and oppression, and that we all have the power to make our own decisions, and we're not I guess a victim, so to speak, or stuck in a lifetime of being a perpetrator because we're a man or because we're white, that we actually still can have an impact on change. So I just wanted to add that in. And then again, you know, the caveat here is that you have to remember socialization, of course, makes a difference. So I have years of experience steeped in white culture, you know, letting my privilege run rampant as a white person. And so it will take me a lot more effort to get a handle on that, a lot more work, versus, you know, my socialization or my identity as a trans person, like I said before, kind of gives me a little bit of a leg up. So it's not to say that the playing field is totally even, but does give us a little bit more power than initially we had talked about, where your identity just chose your own fate. Okay, so I'm gonna pause, and we are gonna have a chance. I'd like to let you all ask some questions, maybe share a few reflections, whatever you need. I just talked for a half hour straight. So I'd love to hear from you, and I'm also gonna open up the chat and take a look.
Everyone was very moved by the video,
Yeah, I see that.
but a lot of people commented.
Great.
So if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself to ask that question, or you can just put it in the chat.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pause for a moment here, give all of that information a chance to settle. And also, you know, I'm not perfect at explaining things, so I might have mixed things up or forgot a key moment that would have helped you digest the information. So I'd love to have a chance to go back and clarify anything that might have been confused. Is everybody doing okay? Oh, great.
Okay, I'm going to unmute everybody so they can speak. Celeste is
Probably this week, like later Thursday or Friday.
get them all.
Next week is best when I can do it.
Oh, there.
Okay, I'm seeing there's a question here from Crystal. What are the definitions of queer used as a label? We're gonna talk about that certainly. I'm never sure when to talk about it. Sometimes, yeah, I talk about it in the beginning and sometimes later on. I will definitely get to that one. Yeah. Great, and then Randy, I'm seeing your comment as well. Fantastic. And then the question about language, great. Okay, so I think what I'm gonna do is hold on to these questions and make sure that I work them in naturally as I'm talking. Yeah, great, 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 okay. All right. Okay. So let's move on, and I'm gonna keep referencing these questions and work them in, and there'll be time at the end if I didn't get to them to re-clarify. All right. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about gender, what it is, what it's not, and then we'll have a slide for each: gender, sexuality, biological sex. So here. You know, I feel like I've said a lot about gender already, maybe less in terms of definition and maybe more just contextually tried to give a lot of information about gender. What I will say is that gender, so just building from the ground up, gender and biological sex are different, and that they're often used as synonyms, which is terribly confusing. So if you fill out a federal form, you know, sometimes it might say gender, M or F. Sometimes it might say sex, M or F. And really the truth is that those are two totally different things. Biological sex is about our bodies, and we'll get into a slide more about biological sex later. But those are, you know, male, female, intersex. I still do actually call myself, I can feel like I would feel comfortable calling myself transsexual, just by definition of that word. It's really fallen out of favor though, and a lot of people don't use it. But for me, it is an accurate way to describe that my biological sex has shifted from surgeries that I've had and hormones that I've introduced to my body. So, and then gender is really about, it's a social construct. And that's what's very difficult to define here, is what actually is gender. And unfortunately, I think what's happened in my own experience is that I've gone so far down the rabbit hole, I actually don't know if I could define it, because I've done too much exploration and I need to come back up out of the rabbit hole again, which I haven't done. So all I can say for myself is that we are taught there are two genders, man and woman, boy and girl. And we have lots and lots and lots of stories about what is a girl and what is a boy. Tons of stories. It impacts every aspect of our life. And most people, you know, take that story and make it their own. And yes, they're a girl or a woman, but maybe they're their own unique flavor of girl or woman. For myself, I felt that I couldn't describe myself in either of those categories at all. I was too far on the outskirts. And what's interesting here is that gender can be asserted as young as 3 to 5 years old. And think about 3 to 5 years old, 3 to 5 year olds, they're asserting a lot about themselves. And they already have an understanding of this social construct, gender, and how it might apply to them. Not all kids, though, will assert their gender identity that young. Think about a young person who already knows that if they said something other than what their parents or guardians were saying about them, it would not go over well. So they already just have a gut feeling that if, you know, my family thinks I'm a girl and I told them I was a boy, it would not go over well. So they don't, you know, they wait to come out later in their life. Or someone like myself didn't have language for another kind of gender identity. And so I didn't say anything because I didn't feel like I was a girl, yeah, but I also knew I wasn't a boy. So I just stayed with girl until I was in my 20s and met someone who identified as non-binary. And then realized, okay, there's more genders than two. That best describes me. So for myself, I actually, the way that I describe my gender is more like not man or woman, something else, and less like it's this thing. This thing is the thing that resonates with me. And I think for some people, it's more like that. You know, they find a word, a description of their gender identity, and that's their gender identity, and that's what feels like home. For me, it's more of the absence of binary gender. So anyway, that's gender identity. Gender expression is just how we are seen, and you know, the ways that we gender hair and facial hair and clothing and speech patterns and tone of voice and everything about us when we walk into a room is gendered. So unfortunately, I would say a lot of these things for trans folks are hard to, they're so unconscious, they're hard to change. So for myself, I have introduced testosterone into my body, which physically lowered my voice. But when I speak on the phone with someone who is hearing the tone of my voice, but maybe not also seeing the beard on my face or whatever else might cue them towards masculine or, away from feminine, will still misgender me as a woman. And the reason is because I have spent 20 some years of my life being socialized to speak as a girl and as a woman. Again, the social construct of that. And I haven't done any work to change those speech patterns. So I'm misgendered as feminine over the phone. Gender orientation, I actually don't want to talk about, but suffice it to say, there's lots of different ways to talk about gender. I think most important is just that gender is different than biological sex. It's a social construct, and we begin to assert it 3 to 5 years old, but it can take longer because of the environment that we're in.
Sorin, before you get too far off this topic, someone is asking, would you also speak about non-binary? What is the definition of that?
Yeah, perfect. So I think it's just in response to, there are binary genders, man, woman, and non-binary is making space for folks who maybe feel that that their gender is not man or woman. For some people, that could be more agender, the absence of gender. This whole gender thing doesn't seem relevant to me. My gender is agender. There's like an absence of gender in the way that I experience my gender. For some folks, it could be gender queer. So for myself, I think it's a little bit more of, I feel both like how we describe the gender man and the gender woman, and my non-binary gender queer experience is of kind of a blend of those two. But non-binary is just acknowledging that there are more genders than two, and then that can be somebody's gender identity, is something outside of those two. All right, I'm gonna just skip ahead, make sure we have time for questions and answers. So most important thing here when we're talking about gender and really anything is if you want to minimize harm, is don't make assumptions. That's where we get into the most trouble here unintentionally. And this goes back to somebody's question about language being hurtful and the example of partner versus husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend. We can create a lot of space for people who identify outside of all of these heteronormative identities by not making assumptions and just asking, do you have significant others in your life? So a question like that not only leaves space for the gender of that person could be anything, the relationship label could be anything, marriage, not marriage, all of those things. But also making it plural allows for folks who are polyamorous to answer about partners, significant others in their life, where usually our society is hyper-focused on monogamy and having one significant other in your life. And we can use this for everything. We can ask open-ended questions instead of asking closed-ended questions or making assumptions with our language. And that feels great to queer and trans folks, I can just say. And then some helpful hints here. If you're not going to make assumptions, how do you get the information that you need? How do you work with this? We can start off by ask questions. And a best practice guideline here is, I could introduce myself. Hey, my name is Sorin. I use they, their, them pronouns. What's your name? What pronouns do you use? So you can, be the person who kind of sets the precedent there and takes the risk first. Really important is to listen. When someone gives you information and says that they are non-binary, they use they, their, them pronouns, they're Jewish, you know, whatever it is, to use that information again, to listen and use that information again. So I love it when I introduce myself, I say, my name is Sorin, I use they, their, them pronouns, and then somewhere in the, you know, at the end of the presentation, I hear people talking about me using they, their, them pronouns. I know they listened. And then the last one is particularly important, I think, with young folks, but of course with everybody, is believe. So when someone says, this is who I am, I give them, you know, I guess I come from a place of people are giving you the best information they have about themselves in that moment. And even if they change, they evolve, they shift, they grow, it doesn't negate who they are and what they believe about themselves in that moment. So when someone says, you know, hey, I just kind of figured out I'm a lesbian, then I go, great, that's so exciting. You know, tell me more about that. Instead of, and especially again, think about the youth where I might say, you know, no, that's not you, like you'll grow out of this. And the other reason why this is so important to believe someone when they say who they are is that the risks of believing them are none. You know, maybe it's a little uncomfortable to share with your extended family, hey, I know, yeah, that this person in our family was called this name a couple years ago. Now this is who they are. You know, I have another daughter instead of a son. We just found out. The risks are just discomfort versus the risks of not believing someone are huge. People start to grow anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation and turn to substances and eating disorders to cope. The list goes on and on. They're more at risk for abuse and homicide. So sometimes when parents are thinking they're doing the right thing by hoping that this will go away so that their child has a more normal life and doesn't suffer, actually can be putting them at significant risk by not validating their experience. So I just want to do a little bit of a talk about pronouns, and then I think that's where we'll end for today. Sorry, sometimes that just happens. I did want to talk a little bit more about, I'll talk about queer for sure, but I did want to talk more about biological sex, but just because it's interesting, not because it's extremely relevant to this presentation as a whole. So pronouns are what I have come to understand as a lot of folks, their entry point into understanding trans experience, well, some portion of it. So when I say my name is Sorin and I use they, their, them pronouns, a lot of people get clued in. Wait a second, if Sorin uses they, their, them pronouns, not he or she, you know, what are they saying about their gender? There's, you know, there must be something here that I don't know about. And then what's happened as a result is that there is a lot of energy around the topic of pronouns right now. And that's fine. I think my only concern is that I just don't want the transgender experience to get reduced to pronouns. And I'm afraid of organizations implementing a pronoun policy and then washing their hands, you know, yes, we are inclusive of trans people now because we have a pronoun policy. And being inclusive of trans folks is so much more than that. That's just at the very, very surface. I guess I'll just say two things here real quick. One is that pronouns are how we refer to people. They aren't identities themselves. So Sam isn't a he. Sam might be a man or a trans man or trans masculine person and uses he, him pronouns as the most congruent reflection of his gender identity. But Sam is not a he, that's not a thing. And then the other thing I just want to say is that they, their, them pronouns have been argued as not grammatically correct because they're plural and we can't use them to refer to a singular person. And I just want to say that's not true. For those of us who are, proficient in English and maybe native English speakers, we use they, their, them to describe folks in the singular constantly. Somebody walks out of the room and we go, oh, darn, is this their cell phone? Can you run and go give this to them, right? We do it unconsciously. And then the trick will be just to use it consciously for a singular person and to make that switch. And then the last thing I'll add is just that the APA, American Psychological Association, recently changed their guidelines. And instead of using he for everybody, or then later, during feminist movement, he/she, now they're recommending, or they've said now the best practice is use they, their, them when referring to folks. Okay, so let's talk about queer. Maybe close your eyes. I think it gets a little dizzying. Okay, we'll talk about the word queer, and then goodness, maybe we'll have 5 minutes for questions. I'm so sorry, an hour is very quick. So the history of queer is long. It was used as a neutral word not so long ago, just meaning weird or strange or odd. And then more recently was used as a derogatory term to describe folks who weren't heterosexual or were gender non-conforming in some way, who weren't gender conforming. And now I can say in the most recent history, it's been reclaimed, not for everybody, of course, but for a large portion of people as an empowering word to describe lots of things, mostly gender, sexuality, bodies, relationships, but it could be a lot of other things. And I'll say for myself, there are 2 reasons why I use the word queer to describe myself, and why I would, anybody could use that word to describe me, and that is my happy word. One is that it provides somewhat of a rainbow smokescreen. I can say that I'm queer, and it tells a person a little bit about me, enough about me to say there's something different, but doesn't explicitly describe my body, who I'm having sex with, and all of these intimate details that these descriptors, these labels of gender and sexuality can sometimes elicit in our brains. The other reason why I like it is that there isn't a better word to describe me. I would have to list off a whole lot of things. I am pansexual and polyamorous and non-binary and transsexual and all of these things to give you a picture of who I am. And queer is just, can be the best one. How do you describe someone who is not a man or a woman, who is attracted to lots of different genders? Just there isn't a great word for that. So I describe my gender as queer, not man or woman. My sexuality is queer. I'm not gay, that doesn't feel right. I'm not straight, and both of those kind of have a determination on your, or they reference your gender. So that's why they don't seem to fit for me, because my gender is queer. And then also I kind of mentioned, I also describe my body as queer, because my body doesn't fit into the mold of male or female, because of the changes that I've made to my body, or some of the changes that, some of the differences that are just natural, that we all have lots and lots of variations, which is what I didn't get to talk about. Let's end there with just a last statement saying, just kind of reiterating that being an advocate and ally, creating safer spaces for the youth in our life, for anyone, our colleagues, our clients, is an active, ongoing process. We need to be constantly examining our privilege and how it operates in the world so that we can make different behavioral changes to interrupt these systems of oppression and look out for other people and make changes in the system. We can go to trainings and learn more so that we have more understanding and knowledge to filter our responses through. But what it can't be is a one and done. I went to a training, I know a trans person, and so my learning has ended here, and now I am an ally. I am a safe place. It's got to be ongoing.
So Sorin, just to end this, somebody asked this question, and I'm really curious, and we only have 2 minutes.
I know, I'm sorry.
How do you see COVID? I mean, do you see an impact on the trans and the queer community as far as COVID? Do you think it's different?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that anyone who is already at risk of being invisible, feeling like there, isn't a place for them in society, that what they're doing is wrong, to be socially isolated and even more cut off from resources has a huge impact. I think that is true for queer and trans folks, but is true for anyone who's in a marginalized identity, who really thrives on those positive connections and networks that create their sense of safety in the world. So yes, I think this is a very difficult time, and fortunately a lot of LGBT organizations like ours have switched our services over to online and are making ourselves as available as possible. And there are going to be repercussions.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the talk. I know in the chat room, a lot of people are saying thank you, and we have to move on, unfortunately, but we really appreciate you speaking today.
Thank you. And for those of you who I didn't answer your questions, I'm so sorry, and go ahead and email me. I would love to email you back a response or hop on a phone call with you.
Yeah, so I'll make sure everybody has your contact information.
Okay, wonderful.
Everybody have a great day. Thank you.